She stood alone at the edge of the ballroom, her gloved hands clasped tightly in front of her, the weight of 100 stares pressing against her back like an unspoken accusation. The music swirled through the gilded hall, laughter and champagne bubbles rising toward the frescoed ceiling, but none of it reached her. Her husband, Julian Ashford, the Duke of Wethermere, had not looked at her once all evening. Not a single glance. He stood across the room, his dark head bent close to Lady Genevieve Ashby, a beautiful widow whose crimson gown shimmered like a warning. The woman's hand rested on his sleeve as if it belonged there, as if his wife did not exist at all. Cecily felt the familiar ache bloom beneath her ribs. 3 months of marriage, and she had already become a ghost in her own life. The whispers started softly, as they always did, slithering through the crowd. They say he only married her for her father's land. Her blood is barely better than a merchant. Look at him with Lady Genevieve. He never stopped loving her. The new Duchess is simply an obligation. The words landed like tiny thorns. Cecily kept her chin high, her expression serene, but inside she was crumbling. She had walked into this marriage with a heart full of foolish hope, believing she could earn his affection, that kindness and devotion could thaw even the coldest of men. She had been so very wrong. The Duke's gaze finally flickered in her direction, but it passed over her as if she were no more than a pillar. Then he turned and escorted Lady Genevieve toward the terrace, leaving his wife behind without a word. Cecily's throat tightened. She could not breathe in here. She needed air, darkness, somewhere the whispers could not follow. Quietly, she slipped through the crowd and out a side door into the cool night. The terrace overlooked a moonlit garden, silver shadows pooling beneath ancient oaks. She gripped the stone balustrade and let the tears come, silent and scalding. She had been so invisible tonight that even her own husband forgot she was in the room. The humiliation was complete. She thought of her wedding day, only 12 weeks past, when she had stood before the altar in ivory silk and trembling anticipation. The Duke had spoken his vows without warmth, his gray eyes fixed somewhere above her head. When he had lifted her veil, he had not kissed her. He had simply nodded, as if sealing a business arrangement. That night, he had left her alone in a vast, cold bedchamber, saying he had estate matters to attend to. She had waited foolishly, until the candles burned down to nothing. In the weeks that followed, Cecily tried everything she knew. She learned his favorite dishes and ensured the cook prepared them. She asked about his day, his interests, his childhood. He answered in clipped, polite sentences that built a wall brick by brick between them. She placed fresh flowers in his study, and he never mentioned them. She wore a new gown the color of summer sky, and he looked right through her. Once, she had dared to touch his hand across the breakfast table. He had stiffened and withdrawn it as though burned. Still, a tiny ember of hope refused to die. Perhaps he simply needed time. Perhaps beneath the ice, there was a heart that had been hurt and needed gentle patience. She clung to that hope like a candle in a storm. And then, one afternoon, the ember flickered with unexpected brightness. Cecily was in the great library at Wethermere Hall, a cavernous room lined with leather-bound volumes and the scent of old paper. She had been tracing her finger along a shelf, pausing at a collection of botanical engravings she had once mentioned in passing to the Duke, steward, not even to the Duke himself. She had said how dearly she loved flowers and wished to understand the gardens better. The next morning, a beautifully bound folio of botanical plates appeared on her writing desk, with no note. When she asked the steward, he admitted the Duke himself had sent to London for it. Her heart leaped. He had listened. He had remembered. That evening she waited for him in the drawing room, the folio in her hands, ready to thank him with all the warmth she possessed. When he entered, tall and imposing in his dark coat, she rose with a hopeful smile. "Your Grace, I found the book. It is the most thoughtful gift I have ever received." He stopped, his expression unreadable. "It was nothing. I recalled you had an interest." "It is not nothing to me," she said softly, stepping closer. "It means a great deal that you remembered." For one fleeting moment, something flickered in his gray eyes, a crack in the ice, a hesitation. She held her breath. Then his jaw tightened and he looked away. "I am pleased it suits you," he said, his voice cool as mist. And he walked past her, leaving her standing alone with the book clutched to her chest, hope bleeding out of her like a wound. The very next day, Lady Genevieve Ashby arrived at Wethermere Hall. She came unannounced, gliding into the entrance hall in a swirl of violet silk and jasmine perfume, her golden hair perfectly coiled. The Duke, who rarely smiled, actually gave a small, pleased bow when he greeted her. Cecily watched from the staircase, hidden in shadow, as her husband offered his arm to another woman with an ease he had never shown her. At dinner, Cecily sat at the opposite end of the long mahogany table, a vase of hothouse roses blocking her view. Genevieve's laughter rang out again and again, bright and intimate. The Duke leaned toward her, speaking in low tones Cecily could not hear. Her food turned to ash in her mouth. After the meal, she excused herself, pleading a headache. Neither of them seemed to notice she had left. She walked slowly down the corridor, her steps echoing in the empty hall, and paused outside the Duke's study. The door was slightly ajar, and Genevieve's voice drifted out, honeyed and cruel. "Really, Julian, you must have the patience of a saint. That little brown sparrow you married follows you about with such desperate eyes. I do not know how you bear it." Cecily's hand flew to her mouth. The Duke's reply was quiet but clear. "The marriage was a matter of duty, Genevieve, nothing more. She is my Duchess in name, and that is all she will ever be." Cecily felt the words like a physical blow. She stumbled backward, away from the door, away from the sound of her own heart shattering. She had been told, time and again, by his coldness, by his distance. But to hear it spoken aloud to another woman in that tone of weary dismissal, it destroyed the last flicker of hope inside her. That night she did not cry. She lay in her vast, empty bed, staring at the canopy above, and something inside her quietly closed its doors. She could not force a man to love her. She could not spend her life begging for scraps of affection. If she was to be a duchess in name only, then she would be the best duchess this estate had ever seen, and she would do it for herself, not for him. The next morning, Cecily rose before dawn. She dismissed the lady's maid who had been assigned to her and chose her own gown, a simple wool dress of deep blue that was practical and unadorned. She twisted her chestnut hair into a neat knot and went down to the kitchens. The staff was startled to see the Duchess there, sleeves rolled up, asking to review the household accounts. By midday, she had reorganized the entire weekly budget, saving enough to provide proper meals for the tenant families who had been struggling through a poor harvest. Over the following weeks, the transformation continued. Cecily visited every cottage on the estate, learning names, listening to concerns, arranging for a new well to be dug in the village. She sat with sick children and read to elderly widows. She planted a kitchen garden behind the east wing and spent hours with soil on her hands, feeling more at peace than she ever had in a ballroom. She stopped waiting for the Duke to join her at breakfast. She stopped looking up hopefully whenever the door opened. She became polite, gracious, and utterly distant. The same armor of ice he had always worn now turned back upon him. The Duke noticed. At first it was small things. Her chair at dinner was empty too often. When she did attend, she spoke cheerfully about drainage ditches and crop rotation and the new school she was establishing, but never once asked about his day. Her eyes, which had once followed him with aching hope, now passed over him with the same cool disinterest he had shown her. She smiled, but the smile did not reach her heart. One evening, he entered the library to find her bent over estate maps, a smudge of ink on her cheek. She looked up briefly, nodded, and returned to her work. He stood there, unaccustomed to being so thoroughly ignored. "You have been busy," he said, his voice edged with something he could not name. "I have found purpose," she replied without looking up. "It suits me." He waited for her to say more, to fill the silence as she once had. She did not. She simply continued her work as if he were a passing servant. The Duke felt an unfamiliar pang, sharp and disorienting. He left the room, unsettled, the ghost of her former attention haunting him. Weeks slipped by. The social calendar brought a country fair to the neighboring estate, and Cecily attended without the Duke. She wore a sprigged muslin dress and a straw bonnet, and she laughed, actually laughed, with the farmers' wives as she sampled pies and judged a sheep competition. Lord William Ashcroft, a kind-faced baron with gentle eyes and an easy manner, accompanied her for much of the afternoon. He carried her parcels, made her smile at his dry wit, and treated her as if her opinions were made of gold. From his study window, the Duke saw them return. He saw Lord William hand Cecily down from the carriage, his hand lingering a moment too long on hers. He saw Cecily tilt her head and say something that made the Baron throw back his head and laugh. Something hot and unfamiliar surged through Julian's veins. Jealousy, raw and unbidden, curled in his chest like a serpent waking from slumber. That evening he sought her out in the garden. She was cutting rosemary, her basket half full. "You spent the day with Lord Ashcroft," he said, and the words came out harsher than he intended. Cecily straightened, wiping her hands on her apron. "He was kind enough to escort me. I enjoy his company." "His company?" The Duke's voice was tight. "You are my wife." She looked at him then, truly looked at him, and there was no fire in her gaze, only a quiet, weary sadness. "Am I? I am your Duchess, your Grace. That is the title you gave me. But I am not your wife in any way that matters. You made that very clear." The words hit him like a stone to the chest. He had no reply. She picked up her basket and walked past him, and the scent of rosemary followed her like a farewell. That night Julian Ashford sat alone in his study, a decanter of brandy untouched at his elbow. He replayed the last weeks in his mind, her absence at breakfast, the way she no longer sought his gaze, the sound of her laughter ringing out for another man, and underneath it all, the echo of his own cruel words to Genevieve. "She is my Duchess in name, and that is all she will ever be." He had said it to deflect Genevieve's malice, to protect Cecily from that viper's interest, but he had never imagined Cecily would hear. He had never imagined the cost. He had been a fool, a proud, frightened fool. Truth was a wound he had hidden for so long he almost believed it healed. Years ago, Genevieve Ashby had nearly destroyed his family. She had ensnared his younger sister in a scandal, using her to blackmail the Ashford name, all while pretending friendship. When Julian uncovered the plot, Genevieve had turned on him with lies that could have ruined them all. He had escaped, but the scars remained. He had sworn never to let a woman close again, never to trust soft words and gentle smiles. Then he had seen Cecily at a country gathering a year before their marriage. She had been kneeling in the grass, helping a weeping child find a lost kitten, her hair coming loose and her cheeks flushed with effort. She had not known anyone was watching. She had simply been kind, utterly and selflessly kind. Something in Julian's frozen heart had cracked. He had made inquiries, learned of her father's desperate debts, and discovered that a vile creditor named Lord Drayton intended to force her into a ruinous marriage to cancel the obligation. Julian had intervened swiftly, paying the debts and arranging the marriage contract before Drayton could act. He told himself it was a practical transaction. He needed an heir. She needed protection. He never admitted, even to himself, that he had simply wanted her. But fear had ruled him. He had kept her at arm's length, terrified that if he let her in, she would become a weapon someone could use against him. So he had been cold. He had been distant, and he had broken her heart. Now he was losing her. The realization descended with crushing weight. He had pushed away the only woman who had ever looked at him with genuine hope, and now her eyes held only quiet resignation. He thought of Lord Ashcroft's hand on hers, and the thought was unbearable. The next afternoon, he found her in the village schoolroom, teaching a group of children their letters. She looked up when he entered, surprise flickering across her face before it smoothed into calm. She excused herself and stepped outside with him. "Is something wrong?" she asked, her tone polite but guarded. "I need to speak with you," he said, his voice rougher than he wished. "About us." She studied him for a long moment. "There is no us, Your Grace. You made that clear the night of the ball. And clearer still the night I heard you speak to Lady Genevieve." The color drained from his face. "You heard that?" "Every word." Her voice was steady, but her hands trembled slightly. "You said our marriage was a matter of duty, nothing more. I have accepted that. I have accepted my place. I ask only that you allow me to live my life quietly and do some good in the meantime." "Cecily," he reached for her hand, but she stepped back. "Please," she whispered, "do not offer me kindness now out of pity. I could not bear it." She turned and walked back into the schoolroom, leaving him standing in the dusty lane, the sound of children's voices drifting on the breeze. He had never felt so utterly lost. The crisis came 3 days later. Cecily had accepted an invitation to ride with Lord William and his sister along the river path. She knew it was perhaps unwise, but William's friendship was a balm to her wounded spirit, and his sister was a cheerful chaperone. She donned her riding habit, a deep green that brought out the copper in her hair, and set out with a heart lighter than it had been in weeks. The ride was pleasant, the autumn air crisp with the scent of fallen leaves. William was recounting a humorous story about his spaniel when Cecily's horse, a gentle mare, suddenly shied and stumbled. The saddle, which had seemed secure when she mounted, slipped violently to one side. Cecily cried out, clutching at the reins, but the world tilted and she was falling, the ground rushing up to meet her. William threw himself from his own horse, catching her just before she struck the rocky path. Pain seared through her shoulder and head, and then everything went dark. When she opened her eyes, she was in her own bed, the canopy swimming above her. The first thing she saw was the Duke. He was sitting in a chair pulled close to the bed, his cravat undone, his hair disheveled, his face gray with exhaustion and fear. His hand hovered over hers, not quite touching, as if he were afraid she might break. "You are awake," he breathed, and his voice cracked on the words. "Thank God." Cecily tried to move, but pain lanced through her shoulder. She gasped, and he was instantly leaning forward, his hand gently pressing her back against the pillows. "Do not move. The physician says you have a badly wrenched shoulder and a concussion. You must rest." "How long?" she managed. "You have been unconscious since yesterday afternoon. I have not left this room." He said it without pride, as a simple fact. His gray eyes were rimmed with red, and she realized with a jolt that he had been weeping. Before she could respond, the door opened and the housekeeper entered with a tray of broth. The Duke took it from her and dismissed her with a look. Then he sat on the edge of the bed, spoon in hand, and began to feed Cecily as if she were the most precious thing in the world. She was too weak to protest, too stunned to speak. That night fever set in. She drifted in and out of restless sleep, and each time she surfaced, he was there. Sometimes he held a cool cloth to her forehead. Sometimes he simply sat, watching her with an intensity that felt like a lifeline. Once she thought she heard him speaking, his voice low and broken. "Please do not leave me, please. I cannot lose you now, not when I have only just realized what I am losing." She wanted to answer, but the darkness pulled her under again. When the fever broke at last, it was dawn, and the Duke was asleep in the chair, his head fallen forward at an awkward angle. Cecily watched him in the pale light, her heart a confusion of old pain and new, fragile hope. The cold, distant Duke she had married was nowhere to be seen. In his place was a man hollowed out by fear and something that looked terrifyingly like love. He stirred and found her watching him. He straightened immediately, scrubbing a hand over his unshaven jaw. "You are looking at me," he said, a ghost of wonder in his voice. "I am trying to understand," she whispered. "You have ignored me for months. You told Lady Genevieve I was nothing but a duty, and now you sit by my bed as if your life depends on mine. Why?" He closed his eyes for a long moment. When he opened them, they glistened. "Because I am a coward and a fool, and I have done you a terrible wrong. I need to tell you the truth, all of it, if you will hear me." She gave a small nod. He drew a breath and began. He told her about Genevieve and the scandal that had nearly destroyed his sister. He spoke of the fear that had calcified inside him, the terror of trusting any woman again. And then he told her about Lord Drayton, the cruel, predatory man who had planned to trap Cecily in a marriage she would have suffered every day of her life. "I learned of it from your father's solicitor," Julian said, his voice raw. "Drayton was going to call in the debts and force you to wed him to clear them. I could not let that happen. I convinced your father to let me pay the debts and marry you instead. I told myself it was duty, a transaction. But it was a lie." He reached into his coat and withdrew a folded, yellowed paper. He pressed it into her hands. It was a letter from Drayton, filled with vile threats and barely veiled boasts of what he would do to the pretty little Vance girl once she was his wife. Cecily's stomach turned. "I had to protect you," Julian said, "but I was so afraid of feeling anything, so afraid of being vulnerable again that I pushed you away. I thought if I kept you at a distance, you would be safe from the darkness of my past and I would be safe from this." He pressed a hand to his heart. "I was wrong, so desperately wrong." Cecily's eyes blurred with tears. "You arranged our marriage to save me." "Yes, but that was not the whole truth either." He looked down at his hands. "I had seen you before, a year ago at the Ashbury Fair. You were helping a child find a kitten and you were so patient, so gentle. I stood in the shadows and watched you and I knew I wanted you. But I believed myself unworthy, too scarred, too cold. So I told myself I was just being honorable. I was a coward. I hid behind duty because I was terrified that if I let myself love you, you would see the broken man I truly am and despise me." A sob escaped her. "All this time you loved me." "I loved you before I ever spoke your name," he said, his voice breaking. "And I have been a fool, a proud, frightened fool who nearly destroyed the only good thing in his life." He lifted his gaze to hers, and his eyes were wet. "I love you, Cecily. I have loved you from the very beginning, and I am begging you, if you can find it in your heart to forgive me, I will spend every day of the rest of my life showing you what you mean to me." She was crying openly now, tears streaming down her cheeks. The pain of the past months, the rejection, the loneliness, it all rose up and then, slowly, began to dissolve in the warmth of his words. She saw before her not a cold duke, but a wounded man who had been afraid. And she, who had learned to guard her own heart, understood fear all too well. "I stopped waiting for you," she whispered. "I stopped hopping, it hurt too much." "I know," he said, and the regret in his voice was a living thing. "And I will never forgive myself for causing you that pain. But if you can give me one more chance, just one, I swear I will not waste it." She looked at him, at the exhaustion on his face, the tremor in his hands, the raw vulnerability in his eyes, and she reached out. Her fingers brushed his cheek, and he turned his face into her palm, his breath hitching. "I never stopped loving you," she admitted, her voice barely audible. "I only learned to hide it as you did." He lifted his head, and the hope dawning in his expression was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. Slowly, as if she were made of spun glass, he leaned forward and pressed his lips to her forehead, a kiss so tender it stole her breath. "Then let us hide nothing from each other ever again," he murmured against her skin. "I am yours, Cecily, completely, hopelessly yours." In the quiet days that followed, they began to heal. The physician ordered rest, and Julian enforced it with a gentle tyranny that made her smile. He read to her from the botanical folio he had once given her, his voice low and warm. He brought her cups of tea made exactly as she liked. He held her hand during the long afternoons and spoke of his childhood, his fears, his dreams. And she, in turn, shared her own. The loneliness of her father's house, her terror at being unloved, her secret hope that she might one day matter to him. Lady Genevieve attempted one more visit, sweeping into the hall with her practiced smile, but Julian met her at the door. His voice was ice, but this time it was wielded in defense. You are not welcome here, Genevieve. The harm you have done to this family is unforgivable. If you ever approach my wife or my estate again, I will ensure every drawing room in London knows precisely what kind of woman you are." Genevieve's mask slipped, revealing the venom beneath, but she retreated. She would not darken their door again. As autumn deepened into winter, the people of Wethermere watched the change in their Duke and Duchess with quiet joy. They saw him walk with her through the frosted gardens, her hand tucked into the crook of his arm. They saw him listen intently as she explained her plans for a new village infirmary. They saw him smile, a true, unguarded smile, when she laughed, and they knew that something precious had been salvaged from the wreckage of a cold beginning. One evening, as snow fell softly outside the library windows, Cecily stood by the fire, a letter in her hand. It was from Lord William, a kind, warm note congratulating her on her recovery and announcing his own happy engagement to a young lady from the north. She smiled and tucked it away, feeling only gratitude for his friendship. Julian came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. "Good news. William is to be married. I am glad for him." "As am I," Julian said, and there was no jealousy in his voice now, only a quiet contentment. He turned her gently to face him. "I have a gift for you." He placed a small velvet box in her hand. Inside lay a locket, delicate and gold, engraved with a single word, "Always." When she opened it, there was a miniature of a garden, the very garden where they had first spoken, truly spoken, after her fever broke. "I had it painted to remember," he said, "the place where my life finally began." Tears pricked her eyes, but they were tears of joy. She threw her arms around his neck, and he held her as if he would never let go. In the spring, when the first roses bloomed in the garden Cecily had planted, the Duke and Duchess walked among them, her hand resting on the gentle swell of her belly. The estate was thriving, the tenants prosperous and happy, and the great hall of Wethermere rang with laughter. Julian paused beside a trellis heavy with white blossoms and looked down at his wife with an expression of such profound love that it made her heart catch. "I once told myself I could not love you," he said softly. "I was a fool. You taught me how to be brave, Cecily. You taught me how to live." She rose on her toes and kissed him, softly, sweetly, there among the roses. "And you taught me that hope, even when it seems lost, can bloom again." And so it did. Season after season, year after year, their love grew, rooted in honesty, watered by forgiveness, and sheltered by the kind of devotion that arrives not in a single, dramatic moment, but in 1,000 small, quiet acts of tenderness. The Duchess who had stopped waiting had, at last, been found. And the Duke who had never wanted a wife discovered he could not live without one. The one woman who had seen his scars and chosen to stay. The one who had turned a cold, empty house into a home.